Hello again, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks to all of you very much for coming. And thanks, of course, to the organizers of the conference for putting on this important event. It's so important that the Mennonite Church and the wider historical community is talking about Mennonites' relationship to National Socialism, and particularly Mennonites' relationship to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust of European Jews. This is a conference that is a long time in coming. Many of you may note that it's a long time since the Second World War happened, and we're just getting around to this in 2018. So I'm glad that all of you are finally taking interest in this important topic. It's also a topic that has benefited from the sustained and valuable research of a great number of individuals, many of whom are in this room. And so it's wonderful to see many of you again, and also to meet many people for the first time who have written scholarship that I've personally very much admired and profited from. I had the privilege of attending conferences on Mennonites and Nazism that John mentioned in Münster in 2015, as well as Paraguay in 2017. And so this is clearly a topic that is of great transnational interest to Mennonites and to the wider historical community. And in that respect, I'd also like to bring greetings to this body from the Mennonite Historical Society of Paraguay. The president of that body, Uwe Friesen, says that Mennonites in Paraguay are following this conference with great interest. They're glad that we're putting it on, and they're looking forward to hearing more about the results. As a topic that has public significance, I'm also happy to report that I am one of a number of representatives here of an organization called Anabaptist Historians, which is an online news source for Anabaptist history and scholarship. You can find it at anabaptisthistorians.org. It's providing live coverage of this conference, including panel summaries, narrative reports of the keynote and film screening, as well as subsequent reflections on the conference. And in that vein, if anybody in this room is interested in providing a reflection on your experience of this conference, including maybe connecting it to research that you've done in other capacities, please be in touch with Joel Nofziger, who's right over here. He's the coordinating editor of anabaptisthistorians.org. I'll be talking today a little bit about the topic From Knowledge Production to Genocide, Mennonite Scholarship in the Third Reich. My topic picks up on an issue that John raised in his opening remarks, which is namely that although this is a topic that's of significant interest to the Mennonite denomination, indeed something that we, as many of us are Mennonites, have a kind of moral responsibility to engage with, in the wider historiography, Mennonites have often not popped up among discussions of Nazism and the Holocaust. One of the main reasons for that being that Mennonites were not talked about in any explicit sense by most major Nazi leaders, which is one reason why, in the last year or so, I was quite interested to come across this front page article in the main Nazi party organ, the Völkischer Beobachter, by Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of the leading National Socialists. He had led the party while Hitler was in prison and was considered perhaps the leading National Socialist intellectual. In November of 1929, Rosenberg was writing about an event that was happening in the Soviet Union. Namely, there were about 10,000 Mennonite refugees who, after experiencing the ravages of dekulakization and collectivization, had descended on Moscow, clamoring for permission to leave the Soviet Union and to come to Germany, and from there to travel on to Canada and to the Americas. This was an opportunity in Alfred Rosenberg's mind to talk about the suppression of what he considered to be ethnically German individuals in the Soviet Union suffering under what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. Just to read you a quick quote from this article, Alfred Rosenberg writes, "Bolshevism is a comrade of the Jewish efforts to destroy the entire German world. The National Socialist movement recognized this danger from the beginning and built that into its essence. The extermination of the despairing German farmers in Soviet Russia gives opportunity to sharpen this recognition anew." In other words, Rosenberg saw Mennonites as being a kind of quintessential victim, or perhaps even antidote to the evils of, in his mind, of Jews and of Bolsheviks. Interestingly, Rosenberg kept an interest in Mennonites across the Third Reich, and even at the height of the killing actions of the Second World War, the Jewish Holocaust, he continued to maintain interest in Mennonites, visiting and speaking at the Mennonite colonies of Korditsa and Molochna, the oldest and largest Mennonite colonies in Ukraine. Here you can see him in Korditsa in 1942. So that, in a sense, gives you a little bit of the scope of the talk that I'm going to give. Essentially, I was interested in preparing this talk in knowing what did leading National Socialists think about Mennonites? When did they write about them? Why did they write about them? What was the idea behind what they said? And it turns out, and this totally surprised me, and I've been studying this for a while, so this is actually somewhat of a revelation to me. National Socialist thinkers, and by this I mean mostly not the top tier of National Socialists, not Hitler or Himmler or folks like that, but rather academics who were relatively integrated into the Nazi state. They had membership in the Nazi Party. Some of them were members of the SS. Many of them basically served in university capacities or in research institutes, but were nevertheless mostly non-Mennonite pro-Nazi thinkers, wrote actually rather extensively about Mennonites. Between 1929 and 1945, they produced hundreds of books and articles that discussed Mennonites at length, often not talking about Mennonites explicitly. Often they use racial terms for Mennonites, which explains why the term Mennonite doesn't show up in the indexes of many of these volumes. But nevertheless, the discussion that these individuals produced was relatively extensive. I've chosen to call this body of work Mennonitenforschung. No such term existed during the Third Reich. It's something I've made up. It means Mennonite research, and essentially it describes this body of work that was relatively diffuse, produced mostly by non-Mennonites, and which has mostly not been read by academics since the end of the Third Reich. The Mennonitenforscher, the Mennonite researchers, constituted a body of individuals, most of whom could be divided into either two categories. Either these were anti-communist emigres from Eastern Europe, such as these individuals that you see here, or they were individuals who were born in Germany and had grown up in Germany itself and became interested in Mennonites not because they had known Mennonites during their youth in Eastern Europe, as was the case for many of these individuals, but rather because they became aware of Mennonites in the context of their studies of Germans abroad during the late 1930s, or late 1920s and early 1930s. As in the case of Alfred Rosenberg, the introductory moment when many of these Mennonite researchers became aware of Mennonites was in the context of the refugee crisis of 1929 and 1930, when about 4,000 Mennonites actually left the Soviet Union and came as refugees to Germany. At the same time, a smaller number of Mennonites left the Soviet Union illegally, escaping across the Amur River in southeastern Siberia and arriving in northern China. The event was widely covered in the general German press, including the Nazi press. The Völkischer Beobachter carried over a dozen articles on the refugee groups in late 1929 and early 1930, including 3 on the front page. You can see those here in white. They were also relatively quickly integrated into racial scholarship in what was not yet the Third Reich. This was still the early 1930s. Over 1,000 of the Mennonite refugees were studied by racial anthropologists from Berlin's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, as well as from the Kiel Anthropological Institute at the University of Kiel. And then those Soviet Mennonite refugees were compared with Mennonite refugees from the Danzig area by the same racial researchers, particularly those associated with the University of Kiel. When this study was published in 1934, the main author, Friedrich Keiter, concluded that Mennonites were more Aryan than the average German, and that Mennonites from different areas around the world, the Soviet Union and Danzig in this case, were as racially similar as biological twins. The event also inspired significant interest in the public sphere, also mostly not under the name of Mennonites, but in the context of this refugee crisis. Basically, the themes that these Mennonites had evoked in the popular press, including the Nazi press, were then sort of circulated relatively significantly. One of the Nazis' first important propaganda films, which won the first state film prize from Joseph Goebbels, was called Refugees or Flüchtlinge, which was about so-called Volga Germans who fled from Siberia into the northern Chinese city of Harbin, a city that had been in the press because of Mennonite refugees in the same location. The second film to be significantly about Mennonite themes was Frisians in Peril, or Friesennote, which appeared in 1935, was considered one of the most important films of the year, and follows a small Mennonite population that is experiences hardship under the Bolsheviks along the Volga. And that film will be screened tonight. It's extremely interesting. You can get a sense of how the Nazis depicted Mennonites on the big screen. I encourage all of you to come. This sort of popular support for the study or the depiction of Mennonites in the Third Reich led to a significant amount of scholarship about them. Much of that was produced at this building or by people associated with it. This is in Stuttgart. It's called the German Foreign Institute. It had two major periodicals, one called Germans Abroad and one called the Genealogical Study of Germans Abroad, both of which featured Mennonites regularly. Two other journals of racial research, the Racial Research of Germans Abroad and the German Archive for Country and Racial Research, were founded in 1937, both by university or research institute organizations. These were considered significant scholarly journals. Both of them featured Mennonites regularly. Nazi researchers, these sort of Mennonite researchers, people who studied Mennonites, were interested in Mennonites primarily because most of them lived outside of Germany, yet many of them continued to speak German even when they lived in communities that were primarily non-German speaking. And so here's a map that was produced by one of these researchers of Mennonite migrations around the world. And in fact, Nazi scholars went to most of the places that are depicted on these maps to meet with Mennonite communities. Here, for example, you can see pictures taken by Nazi anthropologists in places as diverse as Manitoba, Paraguay, Ohio, and Saskatchewan. They included studies of Amish, Hutterites, and Mennonites. Mennonite communities were also mapped for various reasons. You can see that there are a number of different types of maps, some which show migration routes, some which show village outlays, some which show the percentage of land that Mennonites had supposedly Germanized in the locations where they lived. In the top central map, you can see where we are located, here in south central Kansas, which was supposedly a Germanized location where Mennonites had supposedly performed outstanding colonial work in the Nazi imagination, and therefore the land was claimed for Germany in a certain sense because of the Mennonite settlers here. There was a shift in the way that scholars wrote about Mennonites at the end of the 1930s. Rather than being sort of for popular audiences or sort of, generally circulated academic works such as these, this sort of Mennonite research increasingly became produced for military purposes. You can see that these two documents are quite different than the earlier ones. The one on the left is a book that's from a series called the Georg Leibrandt Collection, which was a series of handbooks on ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe, which regularly featured Mennonites. This particular book was considered for official use only and not for general circulation. And on the right-hand side, you can see a very detailed map of Mennonite colonies in southeastern Ukraine. This was clearly something that would be useful to invading militaries, and there's data on where one would go in order to find the local Mennonites and other German speakers. What does this all mean when the Second World War rolls around? Well, essentially, these Mennonite researchers, the ones that I listed at the beginning of my talk, were virtually all involved in various forms of ethnic cleansing and genocide during the Second World War, basically all as consulting experts for military and paramilitary organizations in the Third Reich. And they used their theories that they had developed in part by studying Mennonites around the world in order to help military and paramilitary organizations sort who was German and who was non-German, essentially helping to decide who to save and who to kill when new populations came under Nazi control. I don't have time to talk about the exact theories that they developed by studying Mennonites, but if you want to know more about that, ask me in the question and answer period. One of the major ways in which these National Socialist academics engaged in ethnic cleansing at the beginning of the war was to help move hundreds of thousands of German speakers from around Europe to newly conquered areas of Poland. These were areas that had more Polish and Jewish inhabitants than they had German inhabitants, and National Socialist occupiers wanted to Germanize the territory. And so they enlisted the help of so-called experts on Germans abroad to identify populations to bring back and to settle in occupied Poland. This was also accompanied by a new propaganda film called Homecoming, which was produced by the same team that in 1933 had produced the first Mennonite film, Refugees. The second instance of National Socialist academics being involved in ethnic cleansing has to do with the invasion of the Netherlands in 1940. At that time, racial scientists were increasingly interested in integrating the Dutch into broader theories of Aryan identity, and one of the main ways they did that was by looking at the history of Mennonite colonization in Eastern Europe, which over a period of hundreds of years had supposedly provided an example of Dutch individuals colonizing Eastern Europe in a sort of form of Aryan East colonization, as it was called at the time. This was then used as justification for the resettlement of about 5,000 individuals from the Netherlands and Eastern Europe, where many of them took land that had been expropriated from Poles and Jews. The third and perhaps most important area in which Nazi scholars who had become experts on Mennonites around the world were involved in ethnic cleansing during the Second World War happened in 1941 and onward with the invasion of Ukraine and Operation Barbarossa. This is the instance in which Nazi expansion became very firmly wedded to the Holocaust of European Jews. These Mennonite researchers participated in three main ways. One was by going to Mennonite colonies like Mleczna, as you can see in the left-hand pictures, and helping to integrate local Mennonites into the Reich, and by helping to facilitate the cleansing of their villages from Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians. The second major way was by consulting directly for killing squads, such as the researcher Hans Bayer, who was the Ukraine specialist for Einsatzgruppe C, as you can see in the central picture. And on the right-hand side, a number of individuals participated at various levels in the central planning of the Holocaust, the most significant example being Georg Leibrandt, the person who put out that book series on ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe, who participated in the 1942 Wannsee Conference. The fourth and final example of scholars of Mennonites participating in ethnic cleansing during the Second World War was entirely hypothetical and never came to fruition. This was the idea that all German speakers, or at least many German speakers around the world, from places like North America, South Africa, Oceania, and Latin America, would, after a theoretical victorious end to the Second World War for Nazi Germany, be brought back to the Third Reich. Statistical handbooks on ethnic Germans, including Mennonites around the world, were compiled by a research office that was called the Stuttgart-Hamburg Publication Office, which also produced statistics on Jews who were living in the same location. It's clear that had the Nazis won the war and continued their drive for world domination, the final solution would have been globalized in tandem with Nazis' interest in Mennonite communities across the world. The very final thing I'd like to note is that after the Second World War, many of the Mennonites themselves who were living in Europe, who had come under Nazi auspices and often identified as Aryan and ethnically German during the war itself, often with the help of these racial researchers, then turned around and immediately denied that they were German or Aryan or had anything to do with Nazism at all. And many of these exact same Nazi researchers who had been claiming that these individuals were quintessentially Aryan since the late 1920s profited from this move, and in some cases actually helped it by claiming that the Mennonites were fundamentally Dutch or that they were ethnically Mennonite, and in some cases then used this as defense in war crimes trials. And indeed, only one of all of these Mennonite researchers were prosecuted successfully for war crimes. I'll leave it there. Thank you.